My son-in-law sent me a text message on a Tuesday night. "Lorne, this is our home now. You're a guest here, and honestly, you've overstayed your welcome." I read it twice, set my phone face down on the workbench, and smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. But because I'd been waiting 3 years for him to finally say out loud what he'd been telegraphing with every snide comment and cold shoulder. Now that he had, I knew exactly what came next. My name is Lorne Mackenzie. I'm 66 years old, retired from 34 years as a civil engineer with the city of Calgary. I design drainage systems, overpasses, utility corridors, the invisible infrastructure that keeps a city functioning. You learn, in that work, that the things holding everything together are usually the things nobody notices until they're gone. The house on Hawkwood Boulevard was mine. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a double garage, and a backyard with a Japanese maple. My late wife Agnes planted the spring before she got sick. I bought it in 1998 for $287,000. By the time any of this happened, it was appraised at just over $740,000. Calgary real estate does that to you if you wait long enough. Agnes died in 2019. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. My son-in-law came to the funeral with his phone in his hand. I noticed a lot of things in those months. Grief makes you quieter, and quiet people observe more than anyone realizes. My daughter is my only child. I won't use her name things out, and this story isn't about destroying her. It's about what happens when you love someone so completely that you mistake their comfort for your obligation. She and her husband moved in 14 months after Agnes died. The reason made sense at the time. He'd been laid off from his position at a mid-size oil and gas firm when the sector contracted, and they were burning through savings while he explored options. She called me one Sunday evening and asked carefully whether it would be possible for them to stay at the house for a few months, just to get their footing, just until things stabilized. I said yes. Of course I said yes. The house was too quiet, I told myself. The rooms had started to feel like archived files. Everything in order, nothing in use. They moved in with 6 boxes and a U-Haul trailer in October 2021. By Christmas, they had redecorated the living room. She told me it was just a refresh. Some throw pillows, a new rug, swapping out the curtains Agnes had chosen for something more current. I stood in the doorway of my own living room and looked at where Agnes's curtains used to hang and said nothing. That was my first mistake. You can't consent to something by silence and then be surprised when silence is treated as a standing invitation. My son-in-law's name is Kyle. He's 38, and in the time they lived with me, he held 3 different jobs. None longer than 8 months. Not because the market was difficult, because he found each job beneath him within a few weeks and began his search for something better while continuing to collect a paycheck from the current one, right up until they let him go. He called it being strategic. His references, I gathered, called it something else. He drove a 2022 Ram 1500 Laramie, payments of about $890 a month. He financed it 8 weeks after moving into my house rent-free. I am not a mathematician, but I know how to read a budget. They didn't ask me to contribute to the truck. They didn't have to. The $100 they weren't paying in rent, plus utilities, plus groceries that seemed to disappear with unusual efficiency, plus the occasional, "Dad, can you cover this one? We're a bit short." It all moved in one direction. Toward them. I want to be precise here because I think precision matters. I am not a man who resents generosity. I gave willingly for a long time. I gave because I loved my daughter, and because the house had more space than I needed, and because some part of me, the part that still listened for Agnes in the kitchen in the mornings, was grateful for the noise of other people. But there's a difference between being welcomed and being used. The difference is usually the small things. The tone of voice when someone asks you to move your car because they're expecting company. The way a conversation gets redirected when you try to share something about your own day. The dinner parties where you're introduced to their friends as, "Lorne, my dad, he lives here too." And something in the phrasing makes you feel like a piece of furniture that came with the house. About 2 years into the arrangement, I started seeing Helen. We met at a woodworking class at a community center in Tuscany. She was making a small cabinet for her sewing room. I was restoring a rocking chair that had belonged to my father. She's 61, a retired school principal, and she laughs with her whole face. I mentioned Helen at dinner one evening, casually. Just that I'd had a nice afternoon, that she and I had driven out to Bragg Creek for lunch. Kyle looked up from his phone. "You're dating?" the way he said it. Like I'd announced I'd decided to take up base jumping. "I'm spending time with a friend, yes." My daughter exchanged a look with her husband. I know that look. Agnes and I had our own version, shorthand for 20 years of marriage compressed into a glance. Theirs was different. Theirs was the look of two people recalculating. 3 weeks later, I mentioned I'd like to have Helen over for dinner. Nothing formal. Just the four of us at the table, getting acquainted. Kyle put down his fork. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." I looked at him. "It's my house, Kyle." He smiled the way people do when they're explaining something to someone slow. "Sure, but we all share this space, and it feels a bit sudden. We'd need to be comfortable with someone new coming in here. He said we, as if the three of us had equal standing on Hawkwood Boulevard. My daughter stared at her plate. I stood up, collected my dishes, rinsed them in the sink, said good night. That evening I sat in the garage with the rocking chair and thought about what Agnes would have said. She would have said something quiet and precise that cut straight to the bone without raising her voice. She had that gift. I didn't inherit it from her. I only witnessed it. I did inherit something else, though. Patience. The kind that comes from 34 years of government engineering, where you learn that a problem doesn't disappear because you refuse to look at it. You document. You plan. You wait for the right conditions. Then you move. I'd started moving 2 years earlier, actually. Quietly, after the curtains. After the first dinner party, where I'd been introduced like furniture, I'd sat down with a lawyer named Clive Ostrander, a real estate and estate planning specialist in the northwest end of the city, and we'd gone through everything. The title on the house, the clarity of sole ownership, my will, my beneficiaries, my power of attorney. We'd made sure everything was unambiguous and documented, not because I was certain it would come to this, because I was certain it could. I pulled out my phone in the garage that night and texted Clive. "Available this week?" Thinking we need to revisit the timeline. He replied in 11 minutes. "Thursday at 2. Come to the office." The text from Kyle came 4 nights later. I'd just gotten back from Helen's. We'd spent the evening at her kitchen table, talking about nothing important. A book she was reading, a bird feeder she'd put up, her youngest grandson's attempt to play hockey. The ordinary texture of a good evening. I came home to a dark house, let myself in the garage with a cup of tea. My phone buzzed. "Lorne, this is our home now. You're a guest here, and honestly, you've overstayed your welcome." I read it twice, set the phone face down, looked at my father's rocking chair, which I'd finished restoring that week. New joints, refinished wood, the original weave of the seat replaced with something nearly identical. Good as it ever was. Better, maybe, because now I knew where every piece was vulnerable. I thought about the chair for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and sent Clive a second message. "Thursday's urgent. Clear an extra hour if you can." Then I went to bed. I slept fine. In the morning, my son-in-law was in the kitchen making coffee from the machine I'd bought, using beans I'd purchased, in a house whose property tax bill arrived addressed to me. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. I poured my own cup and took it outside. I was at Clive's office by 1:45. He had the file already open. He'd worked with me long enough to know that when I said urgent, I meant it without dramatics. "They've made it official," I said, in writing. Clive looked at me over his reading glasses. "Kyle?" "Kyle. Then we're ready when you are." We spent just under 2 hours reviewing the documentation. Title was clean. Sole ownership, no ambiguity, no co-signing, no shared financial stake of any kind. Utility accounts, property tax, home insurance. My name, my responsibility, my assets. Their names appeared on nothing. Not one document, not one bill. I'd also, 2 years prior, co-signed a small business loan for Kyle when he'd decided he was going to start a consulting firm. $40,000 through a credit union. The consulting firm produced a website and some business cards, and approximately no clients before Kyle lost interest and returned to looking for employment. The loan balance, as of my meeting with Clive, was just over $31,000. You want to address this? 2. In the right sequence, I said. What's the sequence? Notice first. Then we reassess the co-signing arrangement based on changed circumstances. Then we let the dominoes fall in order. Clive wrote something down. You've thought about this for 2 years. The 30-day notice. Ontario uses N12, but Alberta's Residential Tenancies Act handles it differently. Since there's no written lease, we're dealing with a month-to-month tenancy by default. You can issue proper written notice requiring them to vacate. Under Alberta law, for a periodic tenancy with no fixed term, landlord's notice to terminate is 90 days for a yearly tenancy. But given the circumstances and the absence of any formal lease or rent being paid, we can make a strong argument for a different classification. Give written notice. Offer them a reasonable timeline. Document everything. If they don't comply, we proceed to the Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service, draft the notice. I want it delivered by the end of the week. I drove home past the reservoir. The Rockies were visible on the horizon, that flat-topped winter silhouette. Agnes loved that view, said it made everything feel proportionate. You look at something that old and whatever's bothering you gets appropriately small. I felt proportionate for the first time in months. The notice was delivered on a Friday afternoon, courier to the house while I was at Helen's having lunch. Written notice requiring them to either establish formal rental terms at $2,200 per month, somewhat below market for the area, or vacate the property within 90 days. My phone started ringing at 3:14. I let it go to voicemail. Then again, by 4:30 I had 11 missed calls and a series of text messages that ranged from confused to outraged to something that was probably meant to be threatening, but read more like panic. I answered on the 12th call. What is this? Kyle's voice was tight, controlled, but barely. It's a formal notice. You should read it carefully. We're family. You can't just, this is insane. We live here. You've lived here for 3 years without paying rent or contributing to operating costs. I've been patient. The notice gives you 90 days and a reasonable rental option. That's more than fair. $2,200 a month? Where are we supposed to get that? I didn't say anything. The silence did it for me. Dad, my daughter's voice in the background. He'd put me on speaker. I'm here, I said. Can we talk about this in person? Can you just come home so we can talk? The notice is the conversation. If you have questions, you can call Clive Ostrander. His number is on the letterhead. I hung up before Kyle could respond. That evening I started packing. Not everything, just the things that were irreplaceable. The photographs, Agnes's garden journals, my engineering notebooks from 30 years of projects, my father's rocking chair, which I wrapped in a furniture blanket and loaded carefully into my truck. The small things that make a house yours rather than just a structure you sleep in. I'd already arranged a furnished apartment in Kensington, a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor with a view of the Bow River, $1,650 a month. Small, quiet. Mine. Loading boxes in the garage, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Clean, uncomplicated relief. Like setting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped registering the weight. My daughter came into the garage while I was wrapping the rocking chair. You're actually leaving? I'm giving you the space you told me I was taking up. That was Kyle. I didn't. She stopped. I looked at her carefully. She was 35 years old. She had Agnes's eyes and my stubbornness, which had turned out to be a complicated inheritance. You didn't send the text. But you didn't say anything either. In 3 years, she looked at her hands. The notice gives you 90 days. Use them wisely. I lifted the chair. Help me get this to the truck. She did. We didn't speak, but she held the door. The apartment in Kensington was exactly what I needed. I arranged my things on a Sunday afternoon, books alphabetical by subject, tools on the pegboard in the storage closet, the rocking chair by the window, where the light came in at a good angle in the mornings. I set the alarm for 7:30, made coffee on my own schedule, and sat by the window watching the river. It was the best night's sleep I'd had in 3 years. The following week, I contacted the credit union, spoke with a loans manager named, well, it doesn't matter. I explained that my co-signing arrangement with the primary borrower reflected a family relationship that had materially changed. I provided documentation of the formal notice and changed living circumstances. The co-signing withdrawal process took about 10 business days to finalize. Clive filed the formal notice with the Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service when Kyle and my daughter failed to make any payment or any serious attempt at negotiation. They'd spoken with a legal aid office, apparently. Been told their case was thin. There was no written lease, no evidence of co-ownership, no financial contribution to any household expense at any point in 3 years. Kyle had once sent me a $200 e-transfer at Christmas with the note for groceries. I checked, and I still had the record. $200 against 3 years of shared living costs. The RTDRS hearing was scheduled for a morning in February. Helen drove me, which was her idea. She sat in the waiting area with a book while Clive and I met with the dispute officer. Kyle had found a paralegal to represent them. She was competent, but the facts weren't on their side, and there isn't a great deal you can do with bad facts except try to reframe them, which works in some settings and not in others. The dispute officer reviewed the documentation. Property title showing sole ownership. 3 years of utility and property tax records. The formal notice. The delivery confirmation. Kyle's paralegal argued that the length of occupation had established an expectation of continued residence, that the lack of formal eviction proceedings for 3 years demonstrated implicit agreement, that removing them constituted undue hardship. Clive asked one question. Can the respondents produce any documentation of financial contribution to the property, rent, utilities, maintenance, taxes, during the period of occupation? Kyle's paralegal asked for a moment to confer. They couldn't. The officer ruled in my favor. 60 days to vacate, plus costs. Kyle's face in that room was something I'll remember. Not with satisfaction, exactly. More with the clarity you feel when a long, complicated problem resolves into a simple answer. He'd thought, I believe, that I was bluffing, that the notice was a negotiating tactic, that when it came to it I would back down, apologize, find a reason to accommodate. He didn't know that I'd been building drainage systems for 30 years. You don't bluff a flood. The letter from the credit union arrived at their temporary address, a motel on MacLeod Trail, from what I understood, about 2 weeks after the hearing. The co-signing arrangement had been formally terminated. The primary borrower no longer met lending criteria without a qualified co-signer. The outstanding balance of $31,400. I know about this because Kyle called me. Not to argue this time. Just to say, in a voice I barely recognized, that he didn't understand what he'd done to deserve this. You sent me a text message telling me I'd overstayed my welcome in my own home, I said. I took your advice. Silence. Kyle, here's what I need you to understand. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to stop subsidizing someone who had decided I was an inconvenience. Those are different things. We'll lose everything. You'll lose things you didn't own and debts you chose to take on. That's not the same as everything. You're 38 years old. You have time to rebuild, if you decide to. He hung up. I don't know what he decided. My daughter called me 3 weeks later, not about Kyle, not about the house, just to talk. She was staying with a friend, she said. She was thinking about some things. She asked how I was doing, and I told her honestly. Well, better than I'd been in years. There was a pause. Then she said, Helen seems nice, from what you've described. She is, I said. You should meet her sometime. Another pause. Maybe I will. I didn't push. She's figuring things out. That's allowed. The house sold in late spring to a couple relocating from Vancouver, two engineers, which felt appropriate. They offered $762,000, and we closed in 30 days. The proceeds, after the remaining mortgage and fees, came to just over $610,000. I put a portion into a GIC, redirected the rental income from the investment properties I'd kept, and started thinking about what the next chapter actually looked like, rather than just surviving the current one. Helen and I spent 2 weeks in Nova Scotia in August. We drove the Cabot Trail, ate too much seafood, found a small antique shop in Baddeck, where I bought a 1940s mantel clock in need of attention. I worked on it in the evenings at the inn while Helen read. The innkeeper asked what I was doing, and I explained, and she pulled up a chair and watched for half an hour, asking questions, genuinely interested. That's what I'd forgotten was possible, being interesting to someone without having to earn the right to take up space. On the last evening in Cape Breton, I got a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but I opened it. It was my son-in-law. He and my daughter had separated. He'd moved back to Edmonton, to his parents' place. He was working at a flooring company. He said he knew he owed me an apology that words couldn't cover, but he wanted to say it anyway, that he'd spent a long time blaming me for what happened, and had finally, with some help from a counselor, stopped. I read it twice, showed it to Helen. She read it and handed the phone back without comment, which is one of the things I appreciate about her. I typed back, "Thank you for saying so. I hope things improve for you. I meant it." Not warmly, not coldly, just honestly, the way you'd mean it for anyone trying to find their way out of a hole they dug themselves. I put the phone away, and we sat on the inn's porch and watched the light change over the bra's door. It went from gold to pink to something there isn't a name for, and then the stars came out, and Helen pointed out the ones she knew, and I pointed out the ones I knew, and we had a very pleasant disagreement about one of them that we eventually resolved by admitting neither of us was certain. I thought about the rocking chair, sitting in my apartment in Kensington, waiting for me, about the clock in my hands, ticking again after years of silence, about how the things that seem irreparably broken are often just waiting for someone patient enough to understand the mechanism. I thought about my daughter, thinking things through, taking her time. I thought about Agnes, who would have smiled at the inn at the light, at Helen pointing at stars, who would have said something quiet and precise about all of it that I'd have carried with me for years. "Good?" Helen asked. I looked at the water. "Yes," I said. "Very good. That's the thing no one tells you about choosing yourself after years of not doing it. It doesn't feel like victory, exactly. It doesn't feel like revenge. It just feels like the first full breath you've taken in, longer than you realized, and you sit there in the dark, breathing, and you think, this is what I was protecting. This right here."